We're going to be talking about a very important topic about gun violence, the root cause and the real solution, and why we need to go beyond left and right. I've been observing how those who have incredible access to power, profit, and control, politicians, have been dealing with this. And if you notice, what's unfortunate is it is the same recurrent set of events that always occurs when something like this occurs. It becomes a left-right issue. You have people robotically spitting out the pro-gun stuff or spitting out the anti-gun stuff. And that's the level of discourse that those in power, the media, have reduced everything to, because they really don't want to really discuss the root cause of the real solution, which is really beyond left and right. And either they're incompetent or they don't care. And I believe the latter, unfortunately, is true, because I don't believe they really have the intention to really get to the root cause or the real solution. Many of you know I've repeatedly shared with all of you the need for us to go beyond left and right, be it this problem or any other problem. So our Truth, Freedom, and Health movement, many of you know, is a bottoms-up movement. We spend a lot of time educating people on how to think and look at a problem beyond left or right, because the world is a world of complex systems. The world is not that simple. If you try to take any problem and you try to reduce it to a left or right, it's a wonderful way of taking sections of working people and having them fight against each other, or another set of people essentially become hopeless, that there is no solution, and another set of people take outrageous actions because they feel desperate. And we're going to discuss that, but what I wanted to let everyone know, those of you, many of you out there, we have hundreds of thousands of people who have at various levels gone through the Truth, Freedom, and Health program. If you go to vashiva.com/join, those of you who are warriors, you'll be getting access. Obviously, since this is such a sensitive issue and such a volatile issue, we want to have an environment that we can discuss this in a much more sensitive way. So we're going to be hosting it. Those of you who are not Truth, Freedom, and Health warriors and want to become one, you can just go to vashiva.com/join. But what I wanted to do today, as the title says, this is a preview to the system science presentation. 2 years ago, I did an analysis of this, taking a multi-systems analysis, and we talked about the 5 key factors that came out of research that was done that are behind gun violence. And since that time, I've continued with our team to do more and more research. The research we want to share is something you can't unpack in most of the social media context because of the sensitivity of this. So we want to share that in a much more formal scientific presentation. I did want to give people a preview into that. And these are the topics that we'll be covering. There's a whole bunch of things. So it's going to be a 3-hour presentation. We're going to be covering a number of items. First of all, we're going to discuss what is the root cause of gun violence. What's the root cause? What does that mean? In system science, when you look at a very complex system, you don't just go to the surface level. And what I mean by that is, if you think about an elephant, and I've shared this analogy before, the elephant considered a complex system. If you want to fool people, imagine putting blindfolds, it's this very famous story, on various people and telling them to go touch that elephant. And this is the story of a king who brought in 6 blind men and had them touch parts of the elephant. Well, the person who touched the tusk, as I've shared before, thought it was a spear. The guy who touched the ears thought it was a fan, and so on. The guy who touched the legs thought it was a tree. The guy who touched the body thought it was a wall. Well, none of them had a real view of it. It's a wonderful way of people arguing with each other, because all these blind men argue with each other. These are very complex systems. So when you think about gun violence, at every incidence of gun violence, as the media wants to amplify, immediately after that, you have the standard left-wing and right-wing view, pro-gun, anti-gun view. But we never really get to the root cause. And the recurrent process occurs over and over again. So we're going to be sharing what is the root cause. And when you take a systems approach, you actually find out what that root cause is. So that's the first thing. So if you want to understand what is the root cause of gun violence, go to vashiva.com/join and sign up. The second thing is why the establishment needs gun violence. So if you think about this, if you have a serious problem in your household or your family, and you're serious about it, you go solve it. Well, it seems like this problem never really gets solved, or the problem isn't even defined properly. So the second thing we're going to talk about is why the establishment needs gun violence, like why they need this to be a recurrent problem. And you're going to understand the dynamics of that from a system standpoint. The next thing, we will also be discussing the question of why the establishment will never solve gun violence, why they have no intention to solve gun violence, why it'll always be a story the way it's going, and the left and the right will continue to have a discourse on it, which leads nowhere except to have a discourse on it. And you'll have one wing of the establishment just rattle off all the reasons that we need guns, and the other wing of the establishment rattle off why we should eliminate guns, right? And that's a kind of surface level discussion that'll take place, and everyone thinks they're standing up for their positions. But we're going to get into discussing why the establishment will never solve gun violence, how the establishment divides working people so gun violence is never solved. You have to understand that every time these incidents occur, whether it's this issue or another issue, the establishment is very clever into, interestingly, dividing people into these two halves, pro, anti, and obviously you have another set of people who are just hopelessly done. They don't even want to discuss anything. They just want to sort of hide. And then there's also a fourth group who actually becomes domestic terrorists, and we'll talk about that. It's important to understand how the establishment actually divides working people, and we'll be discussing that at the summit. Why does gun violence always become about pro and anti-gun? Go look at every time there's any one of these incidents, you have people parroting the pro-gun narrative and the anti-gun narrative. And it just goes back and forth. You have both wings profit from it. A bunch of nonprofits profit from one wing, and a bunch of other people profit from the other wing. Nothing ever really gets solved. But you need to understand why. Why does this always become this issue about pro and anti-gun? Why we don't go deeper into the systems level issues, and what are those issues? The next thing is we also need to understand how both wings of the establishment actually profit from gun violence. Both wings. The left may say, oh, the gun suppliers are profiting, but the reality is that the left also profits from this. Both left and right profit from perpetuating this issue when there is actually a real solution, but they never really want to address it. The next thing is we also need to understand who has been the biggest perpetrators of gun violence, but more importantly, violence. This is really important to understand. Who has actually, when you step back and you look at the long arc of human history, who has actually been the biggest perpetrators of gun violence? We need to step back, remove our blinders, and see, as I mentioned, the elephant, see the whole system. And what comes out of that systems analysis is you're going to actually understand who's been the biggest perpetrators of gun violence. And for that matter, violence, when you look at the arc of human history. And that's really important to understand because the media, those in power, they don't want us to ever look at the whole issue. They want us to get caught up in this issue, get devastated by the issue, but never see the whole issue. So this is a very important element we're going to cover at the summit. Who has been the biggest perpetrators of gun violence and violence? And again, we're going to look at this not from a left-wing standpoint, not from a right-wing standpoint, but from a scientific systems analysis. We have to look at the facts, not what we want the world to be, but what it actually is. So we'll be covering that. The next thing we're going to look at is what factor from all the recent research. We've done a thorough review of all the scientific literature today. The question that comes up with what is a factor based on all the research that highly correlates with gun violence? Is it access to guns? Is it poverty? Is it race? Is it mental illness? Is it bullying? Or is it something else? And the good news is that some of the latest research shows that there is a factor that links all of these things, but is really what you call the irreducible factor, okay? That's sort of the connective tissue. And the good news is we know what that is. You won't hear any of this on Tucker Carlson. You won't hear it on CNN. You won't get it on people on social media just taking one side or the other side because it's not something that you can unpack with a soundbite. But this is what our warriors will be exposed to, or warrior scholars, okay? What factor highly correlates with gun violence? And that's going to arm you with really good data. The next thing is the big picture. We want to look at the history of violence and its key drivers. What are the historical factors when you look at the arc again of history that has been really the big driver of all violence? It just so happens that at one point in history, maybe people used knives and maybe people used sickles, maybe people used hammers, maybe people used poison gas, maybe people used guns. But what's been the driver of all of this? And that's really important to understand. So we put things in context. The next thing is, and this is probably the most important thing, because if you take a systems approach to a problem, not only are you able to find what the real problem is, but you're actually able to find the real solution. And that's what the world needs. We don't need people taking a left-wing, right-wing side. We don't need people sort of getting desperate and hopeless. And we don't need people taking terrorist actions. But those in power want people being in the left or the right or getting hopeless or actually taking ridiculous terrorist desperate actions. But there is another way, which is the real solution to this. And we're going to unpack this and discuss what the real solution is. And there is a real solution that we can end gun violence for good. And finally, what we want to talk about is who has the most to win and the most to lose by ending gun violence. Who wins if gun violence ends and who loses if gun violence ends? And you have to look at those. So when you look at these points, this is what we're going to be discussing. Again, to those of you who are just joining, we're going to be holding a summit for all of our Truth, Freedom, and Health warriors, Saturday, June 4th, this coming Saturday at 11 a.m. If you want to be a Truth, Freedom, and Health warrior and you're not one, most of you are, I'm assuming, go to vashiva.com/join. and sign up. But our movement is really a movement. It's an educational movement. It's a bottoms up movement to educate people, to provide people a completely different way of looking at the world in a truthful way, in an honest way, in a scientific way, not in some robotic left-wing way or robotic right-wing way. And that's what you see right after the unfortunate set of events that took place in Uvalde. You had one set of people da-da-da-da-da and another set of people going da-da-da-da-da, and both people are at each other's throats. And most of those people are working people who have nothing to gain from actually being at each other's throats, but there are other people who have a lot to gain. By the way, those of you who are not a Truth, Freedom, and Health warrior but want to learn more, please come to an orientation. It's open to anyone. Go to vashiva.com/orientation, sign up, and we're holding an open house orientation this Thursday at 11 a.m. is the orientation, and we have an orientation at 8 p.m. this Thursday. You can just come if you want to learn more about the Truth, Freedom, and Health movement. So please come, and I'll share more there. We're going to be discussing, but recognize it's only going to come from a bottoms-up movement. It's not going to come from politicians. It's not going to come from talking heads. It's going to come from everyday working people. Most of social media, when I shared some of the stuff back in 2020 on the vaccines, I think some of our videos got like 30, 40, 50 million views, and they were taken down. Same you can see on the issues with the free speech issue. This is probably such a highly sensitive issue that we wanted to make sure we did it in an environment, and because of the sensitivity of it, that we did an environment that was closed and accessible to people who are part of the movement, because the goal is to actually change this. It isn't just to have some type of intellectual discourse. So those of you, I look forward to seeing you all, the Truth, Freedom, Health Warrior Scholars, and those of you who are not part of that program, please come to the orientation at vashiva.com, put it up again, /orientation, and then you'll get an invite to come to the orientation. I hope this was valuable, but I look forward to seeing you guys there. But we need to get to the heart of the root cause of gun violence and what the real solution is, and we need to have a discussion about it if we're serious. Otherwise, we can be in these left-right camps. I don't believe most of our people who are into the systems approach want to do that. They actually want to address this head on and provide solutions. So anyway, I look forward to seeing you all there. Be well, be the light. Thank you.